It's a big responsibility.
I want to welcome you to learning about the archives. We're going to do some touring and give you some wonderful special gems and some teasers to inform you and to make you want to come and visit the archives via 2 routes, which we will talk about later. Everything that we show you today, I want to be clear with you, everything is in the archives. We have not added any kind of outside material that is not already located in the archives. So welcome to the wonderful archives. Our goal is twofold today. One is to, of course, acquaint you and get you more informed about the
Chris, can you lean into the microphone a teeny bit?
for your
Or
support.
so, yeah.
Is to ask for your support and your affection for the archives. We are hoping always to get new information, but we also are hoping at some point to have a move above ground. Okay, the slide. Okay, on your left, you see a slide that is of the closet that we affectionately call the closet. I want you to imagine now that the items, the safe and the table that are there are not there. And in fact, what is there are 2 large filing cabinets. When those filing cabinets are open, the length is probably about 26 inches. So all of those files are within that. And there are 4 file drawers. Next to those 2 cabinets, which are kind of scooted to the side wall. Now, their drawers are coming out toward the door that you see there. The backs are to the window, the little window that you see. Scooted over, and next to that is a small desk with 2 flaps. That is where Peggy did her work. And she had a stool that rolled around, and the top of the stool would wind up so that she could be seated. It was a cushioned stool, so there was a minimal amount of comfort, but at least some. She and I worked together for probably a couple of months actively. She was filing things still that she had received, and she was also organizing and the files that she had already established. And Peggy did a really good job. She had large file folders, and there's 76 named, but there are probably 100 because each of those 76 have subfolders within that file. So these large legal size folders have all kinds of information in it. And Peggy took information and put it in the various folders. So what I am doing is taking that information and now organizing it within each of the folders. I sat on the outside of the doors that go to the closet. I had a metal chair. I had a TV tray that was on metal, not metal, but aluminum legs. It wobbled. And if the booth docents did not need their chair that goes into the desk, I was allowed to have that as well to put papers on while I sat at the wobbly table and attempted to do some filing also within the files themselves. So we were crowded in there. Peggy could not go into work. She could not pull a file unless the door was completely open so that she could get to her seat and pull the file. She had to usually get up from her seat to pull the file out. So it was pretty crowded in there. That bookshelf that you see on the side wasn't there of that size. There was a smaller one there. And the right-hand picture is where we are now. And much credit goes to um, Patty Schrader, who came in with her husband Julio and painted the whole thing. And then she also came and laid the flooring so that we had clean paint and clean flooring. And that was just the best part of that room. You can see the uh, third filing cabinet is a small filing cabinet. And now I'm talking about the photo on the right. And that filing cabinet was acquired from the various materials that are outside the archive room. I wanted to point out to you all of on top, the top shelf way up there, those are all files those are all binders that have secretarial minutes in them and minutes of the meetings. Those are so high, we can't reach them. So our wonderful Rachel climbs up a ladder to get those files, which she and Mary spent a few weeks organizing so that they were all in chronological order. Up above that, you can just barely see, there are windows. The windows, unfortunately, are very dirty and they're covered with enough dust film that you can't see out, but they do let light in, so that is a bonus. The lighting generally in there is pretty poor. It's poor for scanning, especially. You can't, I don't know if you can tell, but if you look at the ceiling light and you look at the windows, that the roof at there slants up. It slants up probably, I want to say maybe 3 or 4 feet. That is covered with acoustical tile, except it's not covered completely. So during the night, we have night creatures that come down into the archive room and leave their famous calling cards on top of some of our work. That was very prevalent in the beginning. It is no longer such a problem, but they're still there. So there are two major aspects that we want to be sure that you're aware of with the archives. They're the total, one filing cabinet is totally archives that have to do with everything about the courthouse. The other file is totally docent. Whatever has happened with the docents, and especially our celebrations, is in those files. When you look at the picture of these files, normally there are quite a bit of papers in them. Let's say the very least large green letter file, the very least that I've ever found had 2 articles in it. Most of the time, there are just tons of papers and pictures and communications with Peggy and even some certificates, and all of this has to be organized. So if what you're looking at, you multiply by 5 or 10 times each piece, that's generally what are in the files. I would say most files have between 30 and 50 items in it that we've been organizing and that Mary and Rachel have been digitizing so that you can have access to it on the website, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So right now, I would like to introduce you to an actual video of the archives. Again, telling you that the lead-in pictures all are absolutely and totally things that you can find if you come into the archives.
Apologies in advance to Lillian at home. The video might not show on Zoom, so apologies for that, but I'll get that to you if it doesn't show for you.
So let me first of all say who I am. I'm Mary Nisbet. You know me as treasurer, but I also work in the archives with Chris and Rachel. And I first of all have to thank Tom, who was the producer, director, and creative inspiration for the video that we just saw. The one thing I kind of disagreed with him about was the perky music at the beginning. Given our descent into what is not quite hell, but close to it, I thought the music from Psycho might have been more appropriate, you know, anyway. I'd like to introduce my friend, Rachel Taylor, whom I have been working with for 18 months. Rachel and I and Chris, we are your basement dwellers who are down there on Fridays usually. We're going to introduce some of the fun things that we found in the archives. Everything we're going to talk about can be found in the archives. And it's been a revelation to me. I've just loved it, to be honest, because there's just so much down there, so much that I didn't know about the courthouse. Just the whole historical aspect of it has been really fun. So we're hoping to engage you in what we're looking at today. So I'm going to start talking about a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to talk about the cornerstone of the 1872 courthouse, and I'm also going to talk about Grosbeck. Now, we know lots about Grosbeck, but there were a couple of things in there that I found that I didn't know. So let me start with the cornerstone of the 1872 courthouse. And here I have to acknowledge and thank Mary Folsom, because although Rachel and I have been working on scanning, this actually came from one of the first things that were ever scanned, and that is in a file that Mary scanned. So I owe you, Mary, for this. So we all know this cornerstone, right? And it's at the Santa Barbara entrance. And it says Ellie Pratt, GM of MCAL AL 5872. What on earth does that mean? Well, it means Ellie Pratt, Grand Master of the Masons of California, Anno Lucis 5872. So basically it was, Mr. Pratt was the Grand Master of the Freemasons of California. And Freemasonry was very active in California. And in fact, the Santa Barbara Lodge was the 192nd lodge created. So it was very, very active. And typically, Masons were invited to lay the cornerstone of a building as a symbolic act, indicating that it was important to have a strong moral foundation for anything, but in particular in buildings, kind of representing, also acknowledging the importance of the foundation stone. They're still invited to lay foundation stones today. That was very, very popular in the 19th century, but not as much today, but they're still asked to do that. And why was it 5872? Well, according to the Masonic tradition, the earth was created 4,000 years before Christ. So basically, sometimes it's 4004, but typically it's 4,000. So if you add 4,000 to any date we have, that would be the date in the Masonic calendar. So that's what that all means. And Anno Lucis means year of light, basically. So who was Mr. Pratt? Well, I dug around and I discovered that's what he looked like. He was born in New York. He was a lawyer. He was a justice in the 17th Judicial District, and he was also at one point the District Attorney of San Francisco, a man of significant standing. He was a Grand Master of the Masons of California between 1969 and 1972. That was very unusual. Usually they were only Grand Master for 1 year, but he was Grand Master for 4 years, basically. And what is interesting is I dug out his gravestone, and there it is. And the thing that is highlighted on his gravestone, in spite of all the things that he did in his life, and he was a very prestigious career, he actually highlighted, or his family highlighted, the fact that he was the Grand Master of the Masons of California. So that was obviously a real feather in his cap. So what prompted me to get on to Mr. Pratt? Well, there was this photocopy in the archives. And it wasn't properly referenced, and the kind of historian in me really wanted to find out more. And I found out that it was, according to the photocopy, it came from a book called 100 Years of Masonry in California. And that was published in the 1950s. And it's a 4-volume book. And each volume is this thick. So I had a bit of a job tracking down where this actually came from. But I found out that it came from the volume 4 of that, and I actually bought it. So we now have this book that I'm going to lend permanently to the archives, basically to start a book, a library of relevant books in the archive as well. So what this story tells us is that Mr. Pratt, who was a very prestigious Mason, this was in his last year as Grand Master, he was invited to lay the foundation stone of our 1872 courthouse, and he agreed. And in preparation for his visit, the local masons had his name carved on the foundation stone and also prepared a ceremonial trowel that he would use to spread the cement to present to him when he came. Now, this is an example of this ceremonial trowel. This one was one presented to Pratt to commemorate the laying of the cornerstone of the San Francisco City Hall and Law Courts in the same year, 1872. So, and you'll see his name is actually carved on that. But what happened was that Mr. Pratt did not, in fact, turn up. So he didn't, in fact, lay the cornerstone. The master of the local lodge did. So what happened to the trowel? Well, nobody really knows. One assumes that the master of the local lodge kept it because it disappeared. However, the plot thickens, because then what happens was that one of the local masons from our local lodge was in a San Francisco pawn shop one day and came across what he recognized as a ceremonial trowel, which was very dirty and grubby. So he cleaned it all off, and lo and behold, it was the trowel from the 1872 foundation of the courthouse. So he bought it for $100, and he brought it back and gave it back to the lodge. And I called the lodge and said, "Do you have this trowel?" And the man I spoke to, who was the building manager, was fascinated by the story. He didn't know anything about this. And he went and had a look to see if the trowel that was on show right now was the trowel. And in fact, it's not. But he's promised me that he says their archives are all over the place and they're trying to sort them out. So he's promised me to look for this trowel, and hopefully we'll get a picture of it for our archives. So the other thing I wanted to talk to you about was Mr. Grosbeck. And these were events in 1918 in Vladivostok, and also with Cecil B. DeMille. Now, we all know this picture of Mr. Grosbeck. He was a cutie, wasn't he? I mean, he really was. He had devil in those eyes. You could imagine him having a good time with him. But again, what prompted me to do this was I found a photocopy again in the archives that wasn't properly referenced. And I tracked down the photocopy to this book by Raymond Massey. Now, I don't know if all of you remember Raymond Massey. When I was growing up, he was in Dr. Kildare. I didn't watch Dr. Kildare to see Raymond Massey, but I did watch Dr. Kildare. He had a very prestigious and extensive career in the theater, but it all started in Vladivostok in 1918. So Massey was an actor, Massey was Canadian. He volunteered to fight in the First World War with the Canadian troops in the trenches in Europe. He was extremely badly hurt. He had a brain injury, and it took him about a year and a bit to basically recover. He recovered in London, and then he came back, and again as a soldier in Canada, where he was sent to prepare US officers for the war in Europe, because by the time he came back, it was 1917, and the US were about to enter the war in Europe. So he was sent to Princeton and Yale to basically train the officers so that they could be sent to the front in Europe. And this is a picture of him at Yale. He was then sent as part of a Canadian expeditionary force to Siberia. And what was happening at the time in Siberia was that the Bolsheviks were trying to basically get Siberia, take over Siberia, and the White Russians were fighting them. And so there was a group, there was a number of countries were involved. The Czechs had a big contingent there. And the Canadian government decided to send a Canadian expeditionary force to Vladivostok to help the White Russians fight the Bolsheviks. And Massey was part of that. And they sailed from Vancouver over to Vladivostok. And when they got there, they discovered that there were 2 private soldiers aboard the ship for whom no military records could be found. Privates Rockcliffe Fellows and Daniel Grosbeck. Militarily speaking, they were stowaways. Both men were untrained and determined to remain so. So already he was a character. So they found something for Fellows to do, but they couldn't find anything for Grosbeck to do at all. He really was kind of useless. And so they put him into Massey's battalion, and he really was, as you'll see, not a particularly good soldier. However, the Canadian government vacillated about whether to send. This was an expeditionary, this was a beginning force that went over there. They were due to send a lot more soldiers over. And the Canadian government vacillated about whether to do so. And the morale was pretty bad. And so Massey's commanding officer basically said, right, we need to cheer these troops up. You've got to put on a show. So having no experience at all in entertainment, Massey was given 2 weeks to put together a show. And he did it. And what he says is, Gunner Grosbeck, he was a gunner by then. Gunner Grosbeck at last came into his own, painting our scenery with great wit and skill. He remained the most unsoldierly and sloppiest member of the CEF Siberia, but he made a large contribution to the Roadhouse Minstrels. So that was Massey basically saying, thank you for getting me started on my career on the stage. The other anecdote I wanted to also mention was, again, I found, triggered by a photocopy I found that wasn't referenced, by Cecil B. DeMille. Grosbeck worked for Cecil B. DeMille, and I found the photocopy that I found in the archives actually came from Cecil B. DeMille's autobiography. And again, I managed to get a copy, which I will put in the archive library. There are a number of references to Grosbeck in this book. They clearly had an interesting relationship, shall we say, love-hate, but one in particular I really loved. So DeMille was trying to sell the idea of having a movie about Samson and Delilah, you know, the biblical story of Samson and Delilah. So he had all these money people come in, all the money men, the men with money come into his office, and he tried to pitch it to them. And they were all very, very skeptical. Why would anybody want to see a movie about a biblical story? And, really? No. But then he showed them this picture, which Grosbeck had done as part of the kind of thinking about the movie. And you have to admit, Delilah's kind of cute, but also so is Samson. And suddenly the money men looked at this and thought, oh, he's selling sex. Yes, we'll fund it. And out came the checkbooks. So that was the little story about Grosbeck, but there's more. So like I said, this has all been driven by finding stuff in the archives and looking it up. And also we've now got the beginnings of a library that will help you too. So that's my story. I'm now going to introduce Rachel, who has a few other things to tell you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Good morning. I'm Rachel Taylor, and I'd like to share two gems. One is about Maya Sexauer, and the other one is the Groesbeck picture. What happened to Maya? Maya Sexauer was born in 1910, and in 1926, when she was 16, she and her brother Wolfram were models for the Spirit of the Ocean fountain. Maya was encouraged to model from age 11 by her mother, who was an artist who had studied in Europe. Maya worked for many famous photographers. She worked in San Francisco and she worked in Los Angeles. When they posed nude for the fountain, Maya and her brother worked 3 hours per day, 3 days per week for 6 months. Initially, they were paid 50 cents per hour until they found out that Caterin was paid 75 cents. Caterin was paid $5,000 for his work. Then Caterin was pressured to pay the two models 75 cents per hour. At the 75% rate, the total pay would have been $162 each for 6 months. They needed fly swatters to flick the insects away, or they would have been eaten alive. How was Maya found? Through an article by Barney Brantingham's Off the Beat. Barney requested anyone who knew the models for the fountain, please call a docent named Bernice Klein. Bernice was deluged with calls. Several days later, Mrs. Maya Seyer, S-E-Y-E-R, called Bernice and said, I understand you're looking for me. Bernice invited Maya to a docent meeting, and the particular day that the docent council was meeting for a continuous education session just happened to be Maya's 70th birthday. So a sheet cake with a photo of the courthouse they enjoyed it under the arch. Maya had lived on Milpa Street for years. She was a cleaning lady and a great-grandmother. Her sharp memory answered the many questions that were asked, and she didn't understand all the fuss about her modeling. And with nonchalance, she said, most of my modeling was in the nude. Now, her clients encouraged her to get a decent job in an office. At that time, the fountain was rapidly deteriorating, and the council was trying to raise between $10,000 and $15,000. So on her birthday, at her birthday party, she donated $25 to the restoration of the fountain. The last photo is a 1958 photo, and this is Mrs. Maya Seyer, S-E-Y-E-R. She worked as a housekeeper at 1420 East Valley Road for Margaret Seeger, S-E-E-G-E-R. And this photo was dropped off at the information booth by Margaret's son in 2024. I'd also like to talk about the Groesbeck painting. Slide 1 shows in 1921, County National Bank moved into 1000 State Street. This is the present day Montecito Bank and Trust. There were many discussions on whether to have a large tapestry or a large painting hanging in the mezzanine. Groesbeck received the commission in 1924 to paint the oil. County Bank used the painting in public relations material. The next slide shows the public relations announcement, and this is what it said. Dan Sayre Groesbeck, internationally known artist, was commissioned in 1924 to paint a historical painting for the bank. Some months later, the picture shown on the opposite side was finished and now hangs on the north wall, which to me is the east wall, of the main room opposite the entrance. The original is 9 by 14 feet in size and has since been recognized as one of the outstanding achievements of Mr. Groesbeck's career as an artist. The next slide is from the 1950s and shows the painting hanging in the mezzanine. The next slide shows the painting with locals dressed in fiesta wear. Let's look at the timeline. 1921, County National Bank moves into 1000 State Street. 1924, Grossbeck gets the commission. 1961, County Bank sells the building to the predecessor of Great Western, who agree to retain the painting. Great Western becomes Crocker, which moved it across the street, which is the old Saks Fifth Avenue building. Crocker becomes Wells Fargo, who sold the building to J.C. Penney, who didn't want the painting, so they put it in storage. In 1994, Docent's Peggy Hayes and David Bissell, B-I-S-O-L, lobby to have the painting donated to the Docent Council. The transfer goes through the Historical Society with the understanding that the painting will hang in the courthouse. There's no space in the museum for this painting. The Docent Council pays for the painting to be moved to the courthouse. The Historical Society deeds the painting to the Docent Council. This slide shows the photo of the painting being moved from storage to the courthouse. A window had to be removed as it would not fit through any door. The next slide shows the painting hanging in the courthouse for 18 years. Then this article appeared in the April 19, 2013 news press. Michael Tobes requests the return of the painting to 1000 State Street when Montecito Bank and Trust moved into the building. The Docents voted unanimously to agree to loan the painting to the bank. There was a public outcry. In letters to the editor, citizens said, "The painting belongs to the public, not a private entity. Also, the Docents do not have the authority to give the painting away." The last slide. The Montecito Bank made a big deal of the returning of the painting. On July 16, 2013, they had a homecoming celebration for the painting. The loan of the painting to Montecito Bank resulted in a legal appeal by the supervisors challenging the Docents' right to loan the painting. The Docents appealed to the California Attorney General, who at the time was Kamala Harris, and Ms. Harris determined that the Docent Council had title to the painting, which was appraised at $200,000 in 2013. But we still must search the archives for the formal notification from the Attorney General and discover the process by which the painting was returned to the courthouse. So the archives still have secrets for us to uncover. Thank you.
I'm going to share a little bit very briefly about a couple of people that you're familiar with, but maybe not this part of their lives. Dwight Murphy, speaking of paintings, is the painting that we all know is hanging in the courthouse stairwell. Murphy, you may not know, many of us thought, oh, gee, he's just a model that's on the Palomino horse. But in fact, that's not true. Murphy was a huge philanthropist. He did the acquisition and development of the waterfront, including the breakwater. He acquired other lands. For example, he acquired the land for the airport. He acquired the land for the Earl Warren Showgrounds. He acquired the land for the zoo. Beside that, he gave tons of money and time to all the organizations in Santa Barbara. I'll read you a quote in a minute. He also was responsible for lining the streets with trees. He was part of the Kachuma Reclamation Project. And in 1920, he obtained a lease on 3,500 acres in the Santa Ynez Valley and built and rented a ranch called Los Prietos Ranch. Prietos means dark or dark skin, which is interesting because the horses that he bred had light skin. He also helped establish the fiesta, the old Spanish days. So he was enormously involved with Santa Barbara. Thomas Stork, Murphy's friend, said that if a list of all the agencies and organizations that Murphy chaired or helped could be made, if that list could be made, it would reveal the depth of this man's nature. But of course, that list would never be made because Murphy never was involved or wanted any personal publications. A very modest man, a very humble man, and not involved at all or interested in any self-gratification. This is the part that you may not know. Dwight's father, Peter Murphy, worked on the Union Pacific Railroad. The railroad at that time had a serious problem because it was because of the engine being fed coal, sparks from the smokestack would fly back and ignite the following cars, which had wood roofs, would ignite them on fire. This was a real problem, and it was a problem not only, as it turns out, for the cars behind with the wood roofs. It was also a problem for the passengers. There is a current book out where one of the passengers, it's called Kingmaker, the book, and one of the passengers is Pamela Harriman, and she is telling how the sparks come back and hit the passengers as well. But Peter Murphy was an inventor. This is Dwight's father. And he started the P.H. Murphy Company in 1892. He produced a fireproof and watertight roof for the following cars, and it was hugely successful. Sold lots of the material for these roofs. And this company then became the Standard Railway Equipment Company. The only thing about this was that Peter developed a throat ailment that caused him to lose his voice. He lost it for several weeks, and his wife Jenny and he became very concerned. So they began looking for a place where Peter could rehab and relax and hopefully get his voice back. They came to San Francisco, and one of the railroad personnel at San Francisco thought they might want to try this little town on the coast of California called Santa Barbara. The Murphys went to Santa Barbara, and they stayed at the Potter Hotel. They enjoyed the spa and the mineral springs, and Peter's voice came back. Before returning to Illinois, Peter and Jenny bought property on Cold Springs Road, and it became their estate, which was called El Tejado. Tejado is the Spanish word for tiles. Dwight comes along, and he's born in 1888. And there's a wonderful story in the archives about how Dwight eventually wound up bringing back to life the Palomino horses, since at 7 years of age, he hated horses. So I leave that to you to find in the archives. The other story I'd like to share with you is this gentleman that we all have figured out is pretty much of a scoundrel. And we know that he enjoyed revolutionarianism, if that's a word. This is André Paul Bouchard. He was born in France, and when he was born in 1780. He actually was contemporary with De la Guerra. De la Guerra, also born in 1780, Bouchard was 9 months younger. So they were men of equal vitality at any rate. In 1787, when Bouchard was only 7 years old, his father had an inn, and sailors came in and talked about their exploits and the lust of finding new territory and some raids and pillaging. And this little Bouchard just decided at that point he was going to do that. He was going to be a revolutionary as well. At 18 years old, Bouchard signs on to one of Napoleon's fleet, one ship in his fleet, and it was called Les Généreux, the generous. Bouchard wanted, now, and this is important, he wanted to reform government. He wanted to abolish aristocracy. He wanted to institute the scientific reforms. In other words, he was very much of a proponent of the age of reform. In 1800, when he's 20, he commands a ship which he loses in battle to Lord Nelson of England. Along the way now, proceeding with Bouchard, he comes to America, and he comes to a place called Baltimore. Baltimore was an area of America that was really rambunctious. They were doing raids on Spain. So the ships that were coming from Spain to trade goods with South America, Baltimore, not only Bouchard, who loved this area of Baltimore so that he could do raids too, were Americans, also seamen, doing the raids on Spanish ships. And this really begins to put a chink in the armor of Spanish trading and Spanish power. Bouchard moves to Buenos Aires. He has now resigned from the French Navy. In Buenos Aires, he marries and he has 2 daughters. And he becomes a distinctive soldier. He runs raids on Spanish ships and nearly devastates $800,000 a year trade from Spain to Lima, Peru. So Bouchard concentrates his raids on the west coast of South America. At 36 years old, he starts his round-the-world trip. He has a ship called the Argentine, and he goes, first of all, to Madagascar, and he frees 4 ships of slaves that are going to be sent to England and probably to America. He won't leave the harbor. He will not let those ships leave the harbor with the slaves. So he is finally relieved by a ship from England who comes with the specific purpose of also guarding until the slaves are off ship. He next heads to the Philippines. Bouchard sinks 16 ships in the Philippines. And then our part of Bouchard comes in when he heads to the Sandwich Islands. In Hawaii, he acquires a smaller ship than his Argentine, and it is called the Santa Rosa. The Santa Rosa comes with 100 men. Yes, in Hawaii, Bouchard is doing relationships with and exchanges with Kamehameha, and he also is finding mutineers. So he was dead set against mutiny. So he was looking for mutineers and he was punishing them. At this time, by the time he gets to Hawaii, Bouchard has captured and sunk 26 ships. He started 10 naval engagements on the sea, and he's started 3 land battles on land. So by now he is very experienced in being able to be a pirateer and very involved with revolution. The story that is most fun that I will leave for you to find in the archives is in Hawaii. There is a gentleman, and I have to pause a minute to be sure I say his name right. Gizalar. Mr. Gizalar is in Hawaii, and he overhears Bouchard's men's plans to begin to head for California. Gizalar has had some experience already with De la Guerra. And the shorter story of the first arrival in California by Bouchard and his ship, the Argentine, and the smaller ship, the Santa Rosa. He now has the fleet of 2. They come to, after several months in Hawaii, Bouchard comes to California and moors in the Monterey Harbor. Sola was the governor of Monterey at the time, and Bouchard decides that he's going to take Monterey. He sends, he decides he'll take, he sends a note to, a letter to Sola saying, if you will just comply, we will come on and there will be less fighting. We'll take Monterey. Sola, of course, says, no dice. We're not going to just give up. And so Bouchard, in the dark of night, transfers from the Argentine 200 soldiers to the Santa Rosa, his small ship. In the dark of night, he transfers these soldiers. The Santa Rosa then is transferred, it is in already the Monterey Harbor. When the captain, Shepherd, sees that his men are very tired and very hungry from this transferring, the captain of the Santa Rosa, he says, okay, we'll wait until morning to do the raid. When the sun comes up in the morning, it turns out that the Santa Rosa is in dead aim right next to the battery of Monterey. You can't possibly start a fight with all of this ammunition looking right at the Santa Rosa ship. So the ship, now in the harbor, sends 3 men to make negotiations. They are immediately captured. And now most of his men on the Santa Rosa, most of Bouchard's men on the Santa Rosa are captured. The ship is captured and it's now under captured treaty, which means they cannot leave the harbor. Well, Bouchard out on the Argentine isn't going to have this. So what he does is, again, at night, he transfers the men from the Santa Rosa very quietly now because they're in the Monterey Harbor, very quietly transfers them back to his ship, the Argentine. When they are transferred, they sail down 3 miles below Monterey. And again, in the dark of night, he unloads 200 soldiers 3 miles below Monterey. And by 10 o'clock the next morning, Monterey is taken. It's pillaged, it's plundered, the soldiers have a super time in Monterey itself. Sola, meanwhile, the governor, has fled to the area we now call Salinas. So he has saved himself, having been warned by De la Guerra. From taking Monterey, Bouchard now heads south, and he takes Refugio. The largest ranch in the Refugio area was the Ortega Rancho. It was very wealthy. However, Ortega had taken his family and all of his wealth and all of his supplies to, they'd gone east inland. Bouchard was very angry with this, and so he burned their barns and he shot some of the cattle of the Ortega Ranch. And then he again heads south to Santa Barbara. And we know what happened. We know about the plantation of willow and what De la Guerra's men did. It was really a supremely wonderful strategy. And Bouchard was kind of acquiesced. From there, that story of Santa Barbara and what happens is in the archives. Bouchard and De la Guerra had communication, and it resulted in Bouchard heading south. So Gilazar is a really important part because he not only becomes a good friend of De la Guerra, but he also brings warning, and he also has a large part of De la Guerra's life after that. So I welcome you to come to the archives to find out more about both Bouchard and Dwight Murphy. Our next thought and our parting thought with you is, how do you access the archives? Now that you know what's in them, how do you get to them? And Mary and Rachel have been digitizing this information and will continue to digitize it. And how are you going to be able to get from the comfort of your home? So you see a slide up here that has the arrow with the circle. Once you go on VicNet, this is what comes up. And you then can click on it, and it shows you then a menu right there of the things that you can access, things that you can look. As we progress with the archives and as we digitize more will keep going in there until we've done all the files. But the files are organic. We're getting information all the time. Thank goodness for those of you who are sending in information and for what we can find. So accessing the archives can happen through 2 ways. One is online through VicNet. The other is in person, and that is by coming in. We're there almost every Friday. Just check with us to be sure. From 1 to 3, we rarely are not there, and would love to have you come and visit if you want to look up anything or you want to handle the original material itself. 1 to 3 on Fridays. So the archive needs your support, your affection and your interest, your ability to talk to anybody about having what we value, what the county should value, and most specifically, where we might be. We would love to be in a place that is above ground. One of the one of the ones I've been telling Mary and Rachel that really amused me is the article that you will see in a minute. Mary, oh, okay. Got the slide up. I'm sorry? Yeah, I have the, okay. This article I found in the archives, and it just amused me so much because the county officials 20 years ago were doing voting in the archives, and they have the exact same complaints we have now. The place is dirty, it's dusty, it's not lighted enough, there's not adequate room, and they had a problem with the exhaust from the cars of the judges who come and park below. That also filtered in, though we don't see that probably so much. It is a very dusty place in the archive, down in that particular room. The lighting isn't good. You saw when Mary was doing the scanning, the lighting is really poor there, so it does affect the scanning. Sometimes there's a bright spot in the picture and sometimes it's too dark. So to conclude, where do you find it? If you wanted a picture of the former Vice President of the United States, where would you find it? In the archives. If you wonder if Sam Smith was an early judge, where do you look? In the archives. If you're curious about the latest location of the jail, where? The archives. If you want to know about the origin of the flagpole, the archives. You want to review the Docent Council minutes from several years ago, they are all in the archives. So with huge thanks to Mary, Tom, Rachel, Mary Folsom, and Patty Schrader, I welcome you to come to the archives, and I thank you for letting us present today. Are there any questions?
Yeah, let's give a special thank you. This was a wonderful presentation. And Mary, can you help me with the microphone? That one down there. And maybe we have time to take a few questions. And Marie has her hand up, so I'll run back there.
Chris? Chris? What am I? Chris? Again.
Oh, you know what it might be too, Tom? Remember we turned up the volume?
Better? Chris, I'm sorry, I'm confused about the CLF files because you said they had their own, but you also have a file cabinet with CLF material.
There's just a little bit of material in that file because most of the CLF material is upstairs in the CLF room. We have just some memorabilia. The file, that one particular small file is not filled at all.
Are we collecting
Yes.
CLF?
Yes, we're in negotiations with Robert and Rodney about what to collect and what to do with those.
Thank you.
Tom, where we're this side now?
I'd just like to say that's the most interesting program or article I've read about the courthouse since I got involved here 3 years ago. And I'd like to make a motion, if that's in order, Madam President, and if it's not, I'd like to make a strong suggestion that the archives team be scheduled to come back at least once every year and report on treasures in the archives.
I think that's a wonderful idea. I don't think we need to have a motion, but I'll make sure that that happens. Um,
Can I just say something?
Mary wants to say something, and then Catherine will hand the microphone to you.
I think I can only do this once a year. It was a lot of work.
And I have another one here.
I wanted to ask about Bouchard. Did I miss when he died and was he ever injured? Oh, do you happen to know, or should I go to the archives?
Bouchard died at 56 years of age. He died in Lima, Peru with his family. And after leaving San Juan Capistrano, which he did not pillage, he went down to Lima and lived quite a nice life. And then in 1962, his remains were sent to Buenos Aires. And he is given there, he's honored with a huge plaza in his name and also a statue there. So
I want to second Tom's notion about your reporting back to us. It'd be nice to have a little mini report at every one of these meetings to enliven the program. A question to Mary. Who was the mellifluous narrator in the video? Yes.
That narrator is a artificial intelligence voice that I use for videos.
Anybody can sound that good. And then a question to Rachel, you're scanning all this material. Where is it stored, in a cloud or on a disk? Or I realize the impermanence of these materials, and it seems they could be lost in a moment without some sort of,
Yeah, well, that's why we're scanning.
yes, but
And that's
where
why
are where are the scans stored?
we put them into Dropbox, and Dropbox basically VicNet accesses it. So it's a continuing thing. Rachel and I have been, I mean, we seem to be taking a lot of time, but it takes a lot of time to do them. And we're gradually basically building them up over the time. And so we're continually adding to what's on Dropbox that you can access on VicNet. Does that answer your question?
So yes, so it's essentially in the.
It takes a lot of time because we're enjoying reading the articles.
Sure. And then just one observation, you showed a photograph of Grosbeck, and I thought he bore quite a spectacular resemblance to the character on the back of the mural holding the beam. And I'm wondering if that isn't sort of a self-portrait.
I don't know. I mean, people have said that it looks like, my mother said that it looked like Errol Flynn, although I think the timing is wrong for that. And we've also said, what's his name? Yes, there's the Douglas Fairbanks is up on the is sitting up. I think you're talking about the one who's kind of right at the front. Yes, with the white shirt on. Yes, yes, yes. Douglas Fairbanks is up sitting next to somebody else, and it's junior. It's senior, not junior. I know. My mother told me that. I don't know. I mean, Rudolph Valentino, I've also heard the name of. So I don't know, but it could be a self-portrait. It's very cute.
I'll just jump in because I have to hold the microphone. And you mentioned my working on, which was very rewarding in the archives, but credit for establishing the computer part and setup and much of the initial scanning should go to Nick Sebastian, who we haven't mentioned, who preceded me in the archives computer setup.
I have one quick question. In the script, or at least the script that I learned from, it talked about the Grosbeck painting, Landing of Cabrillo, that's outside of the mural room, that it ended up being published on a national magazine. But do we know if that's true and what the name of the magazine was?
I have it in my notes somewhere, but you mean there was something in 1934, I think. Are you talking about that far back?
No, it was, at least when I'm giving my tour, I say, oh, we think maybe he got this job because this painting ended up on the cover of a national magazine. I have no idea.
No,
I always say,
the
oh, I'm
mention is
sorry, I
in
don't
19
know.
Yeah, in 1934, it appeared on the cover of a national magazine.
Okay, but it wouldn't be, that's why he got the job to paint the mural room, because that was
No,
before then.
well, I
right?
think he got the job because people knew it in the bank.
Okay, great. All right, it looks like I think we have time for one more question. We always have to be out of here by noon. And then we'll do one last question with Sue, and then we'll give another hearty round of applause.
Oh, I always heard it was because he painted that large painting at 1215 State Street. And it was out in the open because it was so big. And that's how the public knew about it. Am I incorrect?
What it tells us in the archive is that there was a lot of discussion when they moved into that building, 1000 State Street, about getting a picture big enough for the mezzanine. And you saw the picture that Rachel had, that it was a huge banking hall. And so it had to be substantial. But that was why they basically chose to put it up there in that size.
1215 State Street.
Oh, yeah, sorry,
That's
I'm
what's-
sorry, I missed that bit. Yes, yes, yes.
All right. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Give it up for our group. Thank you so much. And we'd love to get you out of the basement. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the meeting. And again,